Thomas spent 3 sleepless nights poring over property documents in his study, surrounded by yellowing papers and old photographs. His grandfather smiled up at him from a faded 1948 snapshot, standing proudly beside the newly carved road. The more Thomas dug, the more his initial shock turned to cold anger. Lake Vista's claim hinged on a supposed county easement, but something about the document's formatting rubbed off. At the county records office, Clerk Marion Foster raised an eyebrow at the HOA's paperwork. "These signatures," she murmured, adjusting her glasses. "The ink's too fresh for a 1960s document." She pulled out original surveys from the archive, spreading them carefully on the light table. "Look here, someone's altered these property lines. Recently." Thomas's research revealed something more disturbing. 3 other properties in the area had already fallen to Lake Vista HOA's tactics. He found Ellen Martinez, an elderly artist, sitting in her garden where her ceramic workshop had once stood. "They said my building violated HOA guidelines," she explained, hands trembling around her teacup. "But I was here 30 years before Lake Vista existed. When I questioned the documents, they threatened legal action I couldn't afford." The breakthrough came through Sarah Chen, a property rights attorney who agreed to meet Thomas at a local diner. Her own history with predatory HOAs was personal. She'd lost her family home to one during law school. "They're counting on people giving up," she said, spreading photos across the table. "But look at these documents side by side. See how they stitched together fragments of genuine records. It's clever, but it's fraud." Together, they discovered Lake Vista's paper trail was a masterpiece of manipulation. The HOA had taken bits of real easements, property lines, and county records, skillfully weaving them into a false narrative that seemed to support their claims. But they'd made one crucial mistake. Their doctored documents referenced a county planning board that hadn't existed until 1975. The final piece fell into place unexpectedly. Thomas received an anonymous email from James Cooper, Margaret Wheeler's disgraced predecessor as HOA president. "Meet me at midnight. Boat Dock 7, the message read. "You're not the first they've tried to rob, but you could be the last to stop them." At the darkened dock, Cooper's hands shook as he handed over a USB drive. "I was pushed out when I questioned their methods," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Wheeler and her people, they're not just after your road. There's a bigger plan. I'll testify. Clear my name, if you can expose them." As Thomas drove home, his headlights caught a familiar luxury SUV parked near his property. Inside, Margaret Wheeler sat watching, her cold smile visible in the darkness. The battle lines were drawn, and Thomas knew the real fight was just beginning. Continued in Part 3, Thomas Richardson was enjoying his morning coffee when he spotted an unfamiliar luxury SUV idling at his front gate. Through the window, he watched as a woman in a crisp business suit methodically photographed his property, paying special attention to his private gravel road. The morning mist hadn't yet lifted from the ancient oaks that lined the path, giving the scene an unsettling quality. He'd lived here for 23 years, and strangers at his gate never meant anything good. Setting down his coffee, Thomas pulled on his boots and headed outside. As he approached, the woman's professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Richardson, I'm Margaret Wheeler, president of Lake Vista HOA." She extended a manicured hand, which Thomas didn't take. "We're just updating our community records. You'll be receiving some important documents soon." Before Thomas could respond, 3 more vehicles pulled up behind Margaret's SUV. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, already talking on his phone. "Yes, we're at the new access road now. The views are spectacular. Our residents will love this." Real estate agents, Thomas realized, his stomach tightening. That afternoon, the certified letter arrived. Thomas read it twice, his hands shaking with anger. Lake Vista HOA wasn't just claiming an easement. They were asserting full ownership of his road, backed by what they called ironclad historical documentation. They'd already added his road to their community maps and begun advertising it as a newly acquired scenic route to prospective buyers. The next morning brought worse news. Thomas woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices outside. His gate's lock had been cut, hanging uselessly from the chain. A stream of Lake Vista residents had already begun using his road as a shortcut, their luxury cars raising dust clouds that drifted across his garden. Near his property line, 2 children were setting up a lemonade stand while their parents took selfies by his antique barn. When Thomas confronted them, showing them his property deed, they simply waved him off. The HOA sent everyone an email, one woman said, not even looking up from her phone. "This is a community access road now. You should be happy. Your property values will soar." By noon, real estate agents were hosting impromptu tours, leading groups of prospective buyers down his road, pointing out development opportunities on what had been his private property for generations. When Thomas called the police, they seemed unsure how to proceed, citing the HOA's legal claims as a civil matter. Margaret Wheeler appeared again as the sun was setting, her SUV kicking up gravel as she drove right up to his porch. "This is progress, Mr. Richardson," she said through her open window, that same cold smile at place. "You can either embrace it or get run over by it. I suggest you choose wisely." She pulled away before he could answer, leaving him standing in a cloud of dust on what had been, just yesterday, his private road. Continued in Part 2. The final day of trial arrived with an unexpected scene. Dozens of Lake Vista residents gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Stop the Fraud" and "Homes Not Hotels." Thomas recognized faces he'd once seen as adversaries, now standing in solidarity against their own HOA's corruption. Inside, Judge Martinez's expression was stern as she reviewed Emma's video evidence. Wheeler sat rigid in her chair as her own words filled the courtroom. "Once we secure the Richardson Road, we'll have all the pieces. Those old-timers won't know what hit them until the bulldozers arrive." "Your Honor," Wheeler's attorney began, but the judge raised her hand. "Save it, Mr. Price. I've seen enough." She turned to address the courtroom directly. "In 30 years on the bench, I've never seen such a calculated attempt to deceive this court and defraud property owners." The ruling was comprehensive. Not only did Thomas retain full ownership of his road, but the judge ordered a forensic audit of Lake Vista HOA's activities dating back 5 years. Wheeler and 3 board members were referred to the district attorney for criminal charges of fraud and conspiracy. The luxury resort developers, watching from the back row, quietly slipped out before reporters could reach them. But the real changes came in the weeks that followed. Lake Vista residents, empowered by the verdict, called an emergency association meeting. The entire board was voted out, replaced by a coalition of longtime residents and reform candidates. Their first act? Creating new bylaws that required resident approval for any expansion or major expenditure. Thomas's case, dubbed the Richardson precedent by legal journals, became a blueprint for fighting HOA overreach. Sarah Chen's phone rang constantly with calls from property owners facing similar battles. Together, they established the Property Rights Defense Network, a nonprofit offering legal support to others caught in HOA disputes. The former HOA common area, once earmarked for resort development, found a better purpose. Residents worked with local conservation groups to create the Lake Vista Community Garden and Nature Preserve. Thomas donated easement rights, properly documented this time, for a public walking trail that connected both communities. 1 year later, Thomas sat on his porch, enjoying his morning coffee. The sound of gravel crunching drew his attention, but instead of unwanted intruders, he watched Emma leading a group of journalism students, recording a documentary about the case. Near his gate, now sporting a hand-carved private road, established 1948 sign, former HOA residents chatted with neighboring property owners, sharing gardening tips and planning the preserve's fall festival. Margaret Wheeler's legal troubles had made national news, sparking investigations into predatory HOA practices across the state. But for Thomas, the real victory was simpler: the quiet return of deer at dawn, the friendly waves from neighbors who'd learned the value of community over profit, and the knowledge that sometimes standing your ground can create positive change far beyond your own front gate. The end. The county courthouse buzzed with tension on the first day of hearings. Thomas sat beside Sarah Chen, watching Margaret Wheeler and her three-person legal team arrange papers with practiced precision. His daughter Emma, home from college and armed with her journalism major's eye for detail, sat in the back row with her camera discreetly recording. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady, "what began as a simple property dispute has revealed a pattern of systematic fraud." She projected the first piece of evidence, satellite images showing Lake Vista's gradual encroachment over 5 years. But as she reached for the next exhibit, Wheeler's lead attorney jumped up. "Objection. These images were obtained without proper authorization." The HOA's lawyer, Jackson Price, was known for bulldozing smaller opponents with procedural challenges. But Sarah had anticipated this. She calmly produced permits for every image, dated and signed. The real bombshell dropped during James Cooper's testimony. "The resort plans were in motion before I left," he revealed, his voice trembling. Wheeler called it Operation Landmark, buying or legally forcing out property owners to build a luxury resort complex. He projected a map showing Thomas's Road as the crucial access point they needed for commercial zoning. Wheeler's composed facade cracked for the first time. She whispered furiously with her lawyers, sending urgent texts under the table. Within hours, 3 men in expensive suits appeared in the courtroom. Thomas recognized them from development company logos he'd researched. During a recess, Emma approached her father, excitement in her eyes. "Dad, look at this," she whispered, showing him her camera's viewfinder. She'd captured Wheeler meeting the developers behind the courthouse, their angry gestures suggesting not everything was going to plan. More importantly, she'd recorded Wheeler admitting to document falsification, not realizing Emma was within earshot. But the HOA's legal team had one last card to play. They filed a surprise motion claiming all of Thomas's evidence was inadmissible due to improper collection. Price dramatically produced affidavits from HOA board members claiming they'd been harassed and spied upon. The judge called both legal teams to her chambers, leaving Thomas in agonizing suspense. Sarah emerged looking grim. "They're trying to bury us in legal procedures," she admitted, but they didn't count on this. She held up her phone, displaying emails just sent by 5 current Lake Vista residents. Each contained documented evidence of the HOA's fraudulent practices, along with a wish to testify. As Wheeler's team huddled in urgent conference, Thomas caught Emma's eye across the courtroom. His daughter smiled and held up her camera, reminding him that sometimes the best weapon against corruption was simply shining a light on the truth. Continued in Part 4.